it is my pleasure to welcome you for the Stakeholder Outreach Initiative by P3 World Council. We have traveled across different parts in the world understanding the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on capital projects, especially the ones which are modeled on the public-private partnerships. We've seen the responses and we've seen the feedback from regions such as Latin America, from Africa, from Asia, from Central Asia as well. One of the crucial regions, ladies and gentlemen, is the Middle East. The reason is because it has the oil economy, as well as we have seen places like Dubai, like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar and Oman go for many ambitious projects. And Middle East is known for its upcoming developments that are happening in the infrastructure and real estate sector. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest today to speak about the developments in the Middle East market, especially in the context to public-private partnerships, is a highly experienced and tenured professional by the name Mr. Robert Bryniak. Before we begin for our conversation, let me first give you a brief introduction of Robert. Robert is a highly motivated and results-driven senior executive with leadership experience in operations, finance, and marketing, as well as with public-private partnerships. He is energized by change management, turnaround challenges, initiating startup ventures, and breaking new ground in medium and large corporate settings, particularly in the power, water, waste management, and environment industries. He has an extensive experience, which includes 20 plus years with one of the North America's largest utilities with over $8 billion in annual revenues, combined with 3 years in international operations and sales with a small cap environmental waste management company in Canada, and 15 plus years in the power, waste management, water, and wastewater sectors in the Middle East region. He continues to live in Dubai and works on assignments throughout the Middle East. Robert, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and being a part and having a conversation with us for the Stakeholder Outreach Initiative.
Certainly a pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much for those kind words.
All right, let's begin the conversation. Robert, one of the things that we are trying to explore through our conversations through this media series is to understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been an unprecedented event that has impacted businesses in a way that we never expected. So how has been the COVID-19 pandemic impact? How has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the overall business environment in the Middle East, and particularly in the UAE, and also which sectors have been severely impacted?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to understand that the Middle East is no different than any other country or territory in the world. There's been a tremendous impact with COVID-19, and there's no doubt about that. In terms of the sectors that have been affected, virtually every single sector has been affected one way or the other. Probably the most serious impacts have been felt in hospitality and travel. They are the most for sure, plus all the associated businesses with them. So for example, hotels have been affected, car rentals, entertainment businesses relying on tourists. So all those areas have been severely affected. Construction has also been affected, especially projects relying on foreign workers and those that are in the tendering phase. A lot of these projects require the company, for example, to have a site visit to get a better understanding of the environmental area that they're doing the work on. And of course, this is very difficult to do if there's restrictions on travel. So definitely construction has been affected as well.
All right. Okay. So what I understand from you is construction, which is one of the core important sectors, and as well as tourism, when we look at UAE, are the ones which are most heavily affected because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen, Robert, that even though the Middle East keeps going through oil crisis and oil impacts, and yet it has come back. So how do you see the current outlook? What is the current outlook for PPP projects in the region, and which countries and sectors in the region are paving the way for PPPs, you think?
I think there's a couple points to emphasize in this regard. First of all, I have to say that the outlook for PPPs is very, very positive. And I say this because governments are looking to the private sector to help them finance projects. And these are all governments throughout the region, especially in UAE. So I think what you're going to see is a lot more PPPs being initiated throughout the region. Utilities wastewater, district cooling, and waste management. And that's largely because they've been able to establish a track record. And lenders are familiar with those particular applications, as well as developers having very good experience with them.
Okay, all right. Robert, we've seen that most of the countries in the GCC, especially, they're going for the national vision plans, and they're announcing the 2030 national vision agendas and everything. So, since you've experienced and worked on many of the projects on PPPs in the GCC, how do you think, and what do you think are the actions being taken by the public and private sector, especially to meet the national sustainable development goals of different GCC countries?
I think, first of all, society at large wants to see sustainable development goals embraced by their governments. And they want to see more attention paid to environmental issues and concerns. So what you're seeing certainly in the Middle East is that all jurisdictions have given this aspect top priority. And they're putting quite a bit of emphasis on all their future plans. You're seeing this in UAE, you're seeing this in Saudi Arabia, you're seeing this in Oman and elsewhere. And this is going to definitely have greater prominence going forward. I think you're seeing much greater emphasis when tenders come out and they specify that they want to, adhere to certain principles to ensure that environmental aspects are being addressed. So that's fairly important. And I think a lot more emphasis on that going forward.
Okay, all right. But we've seen that whenever it comes to the Middle East region, the bankability of the project, when we look at it, compared to other regions that we are examining and having a conversation with, we've seen a lot of investment being attracted to this particular region. So, what do you think are the reasons, that the investments are getting attracted to Middle East since over the past, I would rather say, a decade or so? And how do you see the investment outlook, especially in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic that has hit? And how do you see the recovery going forward, especially for the GCC economies?
When you look at it in the context of PPPs, certainly the Middle East has attracted a lot of liquidity, especially in the power and water sectors in the economy. And international lenders are used to funding a lot of these projects. What's happened, though, of course, with the pandemic is this has slowed investment right across the board. And PPP projects have definitely been affected. However, the general feeling is that investment should start picking up once vaccines are in place and once we sort of truly turn the corner around on that on COVID-19. The only question is when, and I think there's a lot of debate. Is this going to take place sort of later in 2021, or is it likely to be in early 2022?
All right. Bob, since you've worked on a lot of PPP projects since a long time, one of the questions that we would like to understand from your experience is that what makes a project bankable? Because in our conversations, we've been seeing that one of the factors or one of the challenges that many countries, now when we look at Africa as a region or Latin America as a region, with regards to the challenges that the people are facing there or the markets are facing there, one of the major challenges that they face is how do you make a project bankable, or what makes a project bankable? I understand when it comes to a PPP projects, it is a complex project, and because there are multiple stakeholders involved, it has multiple interests of different parties. So in your view, what makes a project bankable?
I think if I was to identify one single factor that influences that, I would say it's having an acceptable risk allocation of the project's costs and benefits. And that's always at the forefront. So what I mean by that specifically is that the government, obviously, or the utility wants to have a low fee or tariff, and they want a high level of service. They want quality of deliverables. And it's difficult to allocate risk to the private sector without returns being commensurate with that. So the question then is can the government entity or utility find an acceptable balance with the private sector? And of course, it's the lenders who are putting up the money. Generally speaking, they'll finance anywhere from 60% to maybe 80% of that. So they want to be assured that they're going to get repaid at the end of the day. So as a result of that, they want some assurances that the revenues are going to be secured. So that's fairly important. Another factor is, of course, with respect to agreements. Agreements need to be to international standards, typically written in English law. And the reason for that is because that's what the lenders are used to. They understand that. And if you
Correct.
start deviating from that significantly, then it's very, very difficult to secure financing. Revenues have to be secured. Procurement process that's followed by government has to be transparent. And at the end of the day, the project has to be awarded. I think sometimes governments and utilities forget or maybe don't pay enough attention to the fact that the private sector can spend a lot of money preparing a bid. I've seen cases in power and water where utilities are spending anywhere from 500 million or $1,000 to $1 million just to prepare a bid. And if the government doesn't award the contract, it's basically money that's wasted. So having an overall transparent procurement process is important, but at the end of the day, the project got to be awarded.
Okay, understand that. All right. Um, Utilities, as you just mentioned, utilities, healthcare, and infrastructure are seen as the key sectors for PPP developments primarily. What would be your advice to stakeholders and authorities towards PPP initiatives and implementations in order to ensure their success?
I think that governments or utilities have to have realistic expectations in terms of what is being paid for the benefits that they're receiving. It almost gets back to the earlier point I made about having a reasonable risk allocation. And it has to be acceptable, and that has to be reflected in the terms and conditions of the agreement that they ultimately sign between the two parties.
Okay.
Governments and utilities need to understand the difference between sort of a PPP process that you're going to follow and the standard procurement process, where the government specifies everything. In a PPP, the private sector has much more leeway to provide the solution, and they should be given that leeway.
All right. Okay. Well, one of the major requirements when we spoke to stakeholders from the PPP ecosystem has been the area of capacity building and skill development. Now, when I look at this, what I mean to say is that many countries are now preferring to have their own local talent being developed in order to work on PPP projects. So, how important do you think this particular aspect is, and what should be done towards it? Do you think, do you think even the line ministries which are getting involved on PPP projects, they also need to, skill their leaders? And overall, how do you see the aspect of skilling and capacity building for PPP projects?
Well, I think it's important to recognize on the onset that PPPs are a unique form of procurement, and governments and utilities alike need to understand the difference compared with standard procurement processes. As I mentioned earlier, there's a significant difference between the two. And right now, there's a sort of a general view that a lot of governments are really not understanding and familiar with that process. Okay. This means that there's a learning curve that the government sector and their employees need to move up in order for them to understand PPPs and how best to benefit from them.
Okay, okay. In the end, Bob, what would be your concluding thoughts on the future of PPPs, especially after the impact of the COVID-19, and when we look at the markets now? So, how do you see the future of PPPs?
In one sentence, I would say there are tremendous opportunities going forward for PPPs. I think governments are incurring significant deficits worldwide, including in the Middle East, and they're going to be looking towards the private sector to help them fund a lot of their projects. At the same time, if the private sector is funding certain projects, that frees up capital for the government to be able to spend in other areas. So I think the future for PPPs is extremely promising.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Ladies and gentlemen, one idea and one perspective that we are getting is, yes, indeed, the future for PPPs is quite bright in the coming future. But at the same time, we need to work towards it to make it more foolproof, to make it more organized and more structured, to make sure that we do not repeat the mistakes that we've done in the pre-COVID-19 era. Thank you, Bob. Thank you for spending time with us and sharing your thoughts with us.
It's my pleasure.